Mighty Marvel Masterworks, The Avengers, by Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, and Don Heck. I don't know if you can hear this, there's some construction going on in the apartment above me. There is perpetually construction going on in the apartment above me, which is why I'm just filming this video rather than attempting to wait for a better time. I'm hoping it's one of those things that sounds, that doesn't get picked up by the camera audio, but let me know how much it interferes with the video, just out of curiosity. Right, okay. These comics. So this is a reprint of the first 10 issues of the Avengers, all the way back from the early 60s, 1963 into 1964. So Avengers 1 into Avengers 10. By, yes, the great Stan Lee and Jack Kirby and Don Heck. Um, yeah, I'll talk more about the comics in just a second. I guess maybe the Mighty Marvel Masterworks. I had not heard of this before. This series. It seems to be relatively new. I tried to look it up on Wikipedia and couldn't find anything. Apparently, Marvel Masterworks, without the Mighty, has been going on for a while now. I'm guessing Mighty just means mini because this is much smaller than usual. So I'm comparing this with Tintin here, and I know Tintin isn't Marvel, but this is what a comic book normally looks like, and this is what this one looks like. Now, the positives of this is you can carry it around with you very easily. If you want to have a comic book as like your reading book at work or something, like you would a paperback, then this is nice and portable and handheld. Disadvantage, of course, is the artwork is much smaller. So hopefully this will show up reasonably well on the camera. So yeah, the early 60s at Marvel, the fabled, legendary early 60s days of Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. I had long been familiar with this time period by reputation. I hadn't I hadn't read these comics until just now. With the exception, sorry, there's one exception. I've got it bookmarked here. Avengers 4, Captain America Lives Again. Now, this one I had been familiar with because this had been reprinted in one of the anniversary issues of Captain America in the 90s, back when I was reading Captain America at the time. My brother had a subscription. And they reprinted in its entirety, if I remember correctly, the origin story of Captain America. Kind of. I'll get to this in a second. Captain America kind of has two origin stories, but this is his origin story into modern Marvel comics. So, yeah, I should probably give some background here to the legend or the mystique behind the early Marvel days. And anyone who's already a comic book fan and already knows all this stuff, apologies in advance. Bear with me or skip forward in the video, or I don't know. Or listen to me, check if I get anything wrong, and then leave a comment. How about that? So, superhero comics, comic book fans give them two ages. There's a golden age, which is the 1940s, and then there's the silver age, which is the 1960s. Now, there was a time in the middle, for whatever reason, superhero comics went out of style. So comic books themselves were still in style all throughout the 1950s. But they shifted to different genres: westerns, horror, romance, funny animals, and superheroes just went out of style. Stan Lee is largely credited for bringing them back over at Marvel. Uh, Marvel. So yeah, the DC comic book characters, the big ones, your Batman, your Wonder Woman, your Superman, your Flash, your Green Lantern, they go back to the 1940s or late 30s, a couple of them. But Marvel characters date from the early 60s, where in a very short amount of time, Stan Lee and his collaborators pretty much created all the famous Marvel characters. Uh, I mean, you can go down the list: the X-Men, the Fantastic Four, Spider-Man, the Hulk, Thor, the Avengers, just about any Marvel character you wanted to name was created in this very intense burst of creativity by Stan Lee and his collaborators. In this case, Jack Kirby, who was I guess his most frequent collaborator over at Marvel. I mean, this is always something that fascinates me. Like DC's collection of superheroes go back a long time, but to just think that all these pop culture legends at Marvel were just created in that very short period, did not exist before 1960, and then by the mid 60s were already established parts of the pop culture landscape. Now, I'm not entirely sure about what the details of the legal rights over at Marvel were. DC, again, was just had a continuity back to the 1930s and 40s. Marvel was largely created out of whole cloth in the 1940s. In the 1960s. They did inherit some intellectual property from their predecessor, Timely Comics. The big three that Stan Lee brought back were the Submariner, Captain America, and the Human Torch. Although the Human Torch got a bit of a reboot. Here's the Submariner. That's one character that Stan Lee brought back. Captain America, that's the other character that Stan Lee brought back. And then the Human Torch in the 1940s had been a robot. He got reinvented as Johnny Torch. Is that his name? The member of the Fantastic Four. Okay, leaving the Human Torch aside. Submariner and Captain America. And we'll come back to those characters in a moment. Stan Lee, DC also revived during this period. I think DC was able to keep in print its big three, Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman, all throughout the 1950s period. But all the other titles had ceased publication. But once Stan Lee made superheroes fashionable again, then DC brought back its superheroes. And DC made a team-up called the Justice League. And so then Stan Lee decided to imitate that with the Avengers. So I guess they were feeding off of each other. But Stan Lee and his collaborators were... in addition to creating all these characters kind of out of nowhere, had a distinctive style going on at Marvel. Each hero had a tragic backstory. Not backstory, because I don't want to say backstory, because I guess when you think about it, Superman has a tragic backstory, right? His planet exploded. Batman has a tragic backstory. Backstory is the wrong word, isn't it? Each superhero has a little bit of a tragedy, angst that's following them around. So Iron Man is, super powerful with his suit, but there's also a middle shard near his heart that he can't get rid of. Thor, at this point in continuity, this might be a surprise to people who only know Thor through the movies, but at this point in continuity, he's trapped in the body of a frail doctor, and he only becomes Thor when he touches his hammer. And then if he's parted for his hammer again, he goes back to being the crippled doctor. The Hulk, of course, is a Jekyll and Hyde type character. He's Bruce Banner, who's not altogether happy about being the Hulk. What else is there? I mean, Spider-Man. Spider-Man's not really in this issue, but he's a teenager who has all the teenage problems. Yeah, I mean, it's not like Superman where they're kind of larger than life gods, although they are definitely larger than life. But there's this element of tragedy or angst with them that is supposed to hook in the readers. There is also continuity between these issues. So things that happen in one issue will be referenced in the subsequent issue. And there's also a continuity across series. So things that happen in the Fantastic Four will affect what happens in the Avengers. And there'll be a very good example of that coming up later. Now, I was reading comic books in the 90s, and I was familiar with this period by reputation. I remember people were writing in the letters columns about, the magical period of Marvel in the early 60s. Even in the DC comics, you'd occasionally get references to that. Aside from that one Captain America origin I just referenced, I never read any of these back when I was young. And I want to say, back in the 90s, these reprint editions, which are, paperback reprints of old comics, which are so available now. Sorry, video camera just shut down again. Second time this happened today. Okay, I'm gonna film. I'm starting a new video file, and I'll edit these together later. I was just saying, certainly I feel like they weren't available. I didn't start getting access to, so I've starting in 2001, I was living abroad. I think around that time they started doing the Marvel Essentials line, which was those black and white cheap reprints of stuff. And Marvel Masterworks may have started around the same time. I don't know. Let me know in the comments what your recollection of this is. But in my 20s and early 30s, I started reading some of the reprints of this period. I read the Marvel Essentials for Iron Man back around 2005. I stumbled across a copy. When I was in grad school at the University of Melbourne, they had a lot of the Masterworks copies in their library. I guess the reasoning being they were of cultural relevance, so they could be in the university library. And I checked out the Fantastic Four. Fantastic Four was the first superhero team that Stan Lee created, so it was the one that started that whole revival. And was surprised and disappointed to find out how terrible those comics were, or how absolutely boring they were, how incredibly simplistic the plot was, how over narrated and over expositioned stuff was, how so many leaps of logic that could really only make sense to a child's brain. The Fantastic Four comic, the Marvel Essentials Fantastic Four, checked it out of the library, was intending to read it straight through and just couldn't finish it, found it so boring. Now, part of this is because these comics were aimed at kids. I think comic books as being aimed at teenagers and adults did not really start until the 1970s, I think. I think that's when the generation who had grown up on Stan Lee's work in the early 60s just refused to put away their comics. And then throughout the 1970s, they were still reading them. I don't know. Let me know in the comments if I'm getting any of this wrong. So yeah, it feels like it's written for a child because it was written for a child. Also, you know, these were about 60 years ago now, weren't they? Um, I mean, it's 2022 already, so there's a whole generational gap in storytelling separating us now from the way these comics were written at the time. Um, so I had low expectations when I picked this up. And yeah, sure enough, there are plenty of flaws in here, and hopefully I'll get into some of them. Um, but yeah, I mean, one of the things though, whenever you read this and you're like, well, this doesn't hold up at all, you always have to ask yourself, okay, but imagine I was 10 years old and it was 1963. What would my reaction be to that? Be to this comic book? And you know, I can only imagine because I'm not 10 years old and it's not 1963. But this is why I love Steve Donahue's channel so much. One of the reasons is Steve actually was a young boy in the early 60s and read these comics. And so on his videos, when he goes through them, and he goes through them quite critically, and he'll mention things like, even as a boy, I thought this was strange, or, you know, I thought this didn't make sense. And so I find it very interesting because it just cuts through all the mythology about, you know, how wonderful Stan Lee's revolution was at that time. And Steve Donahue and Michael K. Vaughan have reviewed these comics. Kind of. They were doing a different edition. So they weren't doing the Mighty Marvel Masterworks. They were doing another edition of the early Avengers. One that had the first 20 issues in it. This one only has the first 10 issues in it. But I will link to their respective videos in the description down below. Check them out. They are, well, let's face it, they are both a lot better at this than me. So what are you doing wasting time watching my video? Go over and check theirs out. Steve Donahue, in particular, does a blow-by-blow breakdown of the first issue of the Avengers and explains how it just makes no sense whatsoever and is just a lot of very sloppy storytelling. I'm not going to get into that much detail of it, but you go ahead and watch Steve's video for a breakdown of the first issue here. Somebody in Steve's comments said, well, you have to understand it was a rush job because somebody else was supposed to write it and they dropped through at the last moment. Now, I've briefly tried to collaborate this somewhere else on the internet, looking at, you know, at Wikipedia and stuff like that. Can't seem to find that. So I shouldn't be passing off something that somebody said in the comments as authoritative, but I don't know. Could be true. Again, if anybody knows, let me know in the comments. Yeah, and then we assemble with the Avengers team by the end of issue 1. The Hulk is portrayed as the antagonist for the Avengers, but then joins the Avengers, and then just goes right back to being the antagonist for the Avengers. I don't know if this was a change in plans. I mean, Hulk joins the Avengers only to promptly quit the Avengers. Yeah, and now's as good a time as any, maybe, to talk about, in addition to the leaps of logic that Steve goes through very carefully in his videos, to just talk about the very text-heavy way that these books are written in. So thinking of a particular example when they were fighting on a train, but it's really all throughout this book, where the characters are just narrating everything that they're doing in a way that makes these very tiresome to read. Oh yeah, here they are. So they're fighting on a train. I mean, look at how much talking there is here. If that didn't stop you, this will. Hulk, wait! You can't keep this up forever. You can't fight all of us. Can't battle all of mankind. Who says I can't? Have to drop off. Can't let that crane hit me. Still after me, huh, Thunder God? Okay, I'm ready for you. All I gotta do is grab me a hunk of this steel cable car. There. Can't do much harm with that hammer of yours if you can't swing it. Don't discount my strength, Hulk. I'll break free of this cable as soon as I flex my muscles. Maybe so, but I'm not gonna hang around and wait. Giant Man, where'd he come from? He doesn't know that I followed on my flying ant, then took a growth capsule to become Giant Man when I reached the train. Those flour bags you grabbed from the freight car won't do you any good, Hulk. You can't get away from me now. That's what everybody says, but no one has caught me yet, big man. That overgrown arm of yours ain't too big for the Hulk to jump over. Now, all I gotta do is shove this flour into the smokestack. Like this. So that's why he took the flour. He created a smoke screen. I can't see. Boom. He's gone. I failed. Okay, so apologies for that, but yeah, just notice how laborious that is to read through. I mean, you know, there's interesting stuff going on. There's people jumping. There's people fighting. But you're also reading through all this exposition and all this narration, most of which is unnecessary because it's a comic book. You can just see what's happening. Yeah, that's one of the reasons. I mean, this is a short little thing, but if you've been following this channel and my weekly reading vlogs, this has been on my mantle for like weeks now because it just takes a while to read through all this. So, you know, I think that's just that was just the style at the time. I don't know. It might be interesting to compare this to a DC comic of the similar time period. Yeah, the Hulk is part of the Avengers, as maybe you gathered from that part I was reading out. This Hulk is much more articulate than we normally think of the Hulk. You know, we normally think of the Hulk as Hulk smash. But there were, I believe, different stages in the Hulk's evolution. So he started out as being grumpy, but not still capable of thinking things through and articulating his thoughts. That would change in the later comics, but that's it for now. But yeah, the Avengers still have a hard time reasoning with him and controlling him. Yeah, and then the Submariner. Submariner is, yeah, one of 3 relics from the 1940s that Stan Lee revived. Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. They revived him in the Fantastic Four comics, which predate the Avenger comics, but here he is in the Avengers. And then, yes, Captain America. So, Captain America was created by Jack Kirby, and I believe, what was the other guy's name? Joe something, right? I don't know. Jack Kirby and one other guy in the 1940s. He was part of a wave of patriotic characters, patriotic superheroes that were popular in the 1940s. There's a whole bunch of them. The Star-Spangled Kid, the Liberty Bell, the Minuteman, the Uncle Sam and the Freedom Fighters. Um, and was very popular in the 1940s, but then went out of style. He was in print in the 1950s, but we don't want to talk about that here because that's going to mess up the story that Stan Lee wants to tell. So Stan Lee has devised this story where Captain America, the reason you haven't heard of him recently is not because he went out of style, but because he got frozen in ice. And then later thawed out. Now, of course, nowadays with the Marvel movies, this is, of course, familiar. Although originally, in the 1960s, Captain America was only 20 years out of date, instead of whatever it is now, like 80 years out of date. It's funny, when I was a kid, it seemed like 20 years out of date was a long time. Now that I'm older, my perspective on time has changed. And I think 20 years, but that's nothing. And I still go back to my hometown every now and again. And it looks more or less the same it did 25 years ago. So for Captain America to... Where is it? He goes back home. And there are some panels where he's completely overwhelmed by the modern life. Hold on, they're here somewhere. Oh yeah, here we go. Yeah, so the girls are still as lovely as ever, but the fashions, the hairdos, how different they are. And New York skyline, ever impressive, ever unchanging. What can this magnificent structure be with all the world's flags arrayed around it? And everybody else, of course, is amazed to see this relic from the past. Sally, look! He resembles a figure I heard my father talk about. A mighty hero of years ago. From all the way to 20 years ago. And I don't know. Now that I'm in my 40s, 20 years ago seems like yesterday. But but enough about that. Now, as part of Stan Lee's giving everybody a tragic story, Stan Lee has killed Bucky off. So Bucky and Captain America are trying to dismantle a bomb. Captain America falls off the plane, but Bucky gets blown up by the bomb. And Bucky actually stayed dead all the way until, when was it? The late 90s or something, when they did the Winter Soldier. So in comic book time, that's a long time to stay dead. This wasn't like a fake out death. Bucky was really supposed to be dead. And so this was Captain America's tragic story, as he could never forgive himself for letting Bucky, for Bucky dying and him surviving. Now there's Rick Jones. Rick Jones had been the sidekick of the Incredible Hulk, but then he comes back and Captain America thinks he's Bucky briefly. Before he finds out he's not. So there's this weird thing going on where Captain America sometimes thinks he's Bucky, and Rick Jones at times wants to step into Bucky's role. Where is it? And one of these later issues, Rick Jones even dresses up as Bucky. It's a little bit strange and creepy, but to be charitable, I think it's supposed to be that way. I mean, I think this is, I think you the reader are supposed to feel that there's something not quite right about this relationship. Now, Rick Jones had been the Hulk's sidekick. So when the Hulk fights the Avengers, the fact that Rick Jones is going over to Captain America to become his sidekick, is going to cause trouble, huh? Here's Rick Jones anticipating this. Like, he's the greatest guy I ever met. And I can tell he wants me to be his partner. But what about the Hulk? He's sure to return someday. And when he finds out that Captain America has replaced him, will anything be able to stop him then? Dun dun dun. But that confrontation actually happens in not the Avengers, but the Fantastic Four. So in the very next issue, we're told that in Fantastic Four 26, we saw the sensational battle between the Hulk and the Thing. So Rick Jones has permanently now gone over to Captain America and the Avengers instead of the Hulk. That happened in the Fantastic Four. So, yes. Again, somebody can let me know in the comments how true this is. The mythology is that Stan Lee was the one who started this continuity, company-wide continuity, where something gets set up in the Avengers, then it pays off in the Fantastic Four comic, not the Avengers comic, and now we're back to the Avengers comic. Certainly by the time I was reading comics in the 90s, this was something that both Marvel and DC were doing all the time. And there is definitely a cynical element to it. You know, it's something people complain about nowadays all the time with the Marvel Cinematic Universe. How things can't just be standalone. They have to be tied into other intellectual property. But as a kid, or teenager, I really found that fascinating. This idea of storytelling as not like something linear, from chapter 1 to chapter 2, from issue 1 to issue 2 to issue 3, but like the story being a web. So like the story starts over here and then it goes off, and you've got to follow over the Fantastic Four. Now the Fantastic Four have their own continuity and their own stories that are ongoing. So now the Avengers story is meshing in with the Fantastic Four story. I think for comic book fans, this is by and large just all part of the fun. The problem comes 60 years later, when you're not buying these off of the newsstand. You're buying this as a collected volume. And in a case like this, I think the publishers should just have included Fantastic Four number 26 as a bonus issue in here. I know some editions will do things like that, rather than just having this gap in the storytelling. But be that as it may, on we go. Sorry, this panel here reminds me to talk about Jack Kirby's artwork. Steve Donahue has a lot more to say about the artwork than I do. I tend to be the type of comic book reader who never really notices the artwork unless something's going wrong. I just kind of take it for granted that there should be good artwork. Jack Kirby, who was Stan Lee's collaborator on creating most of the Marvel Universe. Spider-Man was Steve Ditko, and there might be a couple other ones in there, but most of these characters were created by Jack Kirby, or he was their first illustrator. And you can see these faces are very classic Kirby faces. Like, this was his style. So this is how these characters originated. And I think if you were to visualize these characters now, this is what you would think of. But there is sometimes an element where I don't really understand the physics of what's going on in these comics. And there are other examples of characters. Yeah. So here's... what's happening here? With the... he's leaping up to attack Iron Man. Where one leg is, some of these jumping and fighting scenes. I'm not sure. I don't know. I'm reluctant to criticize Jack Kirby because number one, what do I know about comic book art? And number two, well, he's a legend, isn't he? But as Steve Donahue points out in his videos, from I believe it's issue 8, Jack Kirby leaves. I don't know why, and is replaced by Don Heck. So the last two ones here are illustrated by Don Heck. Yeah. There is a lot more that potentially could be talked about here in these stories. I mean, because these are the early Avengers, there are, a whole lot of first appearances of characters that will later go on to be major figures in the Marvel universe and now in the Marvel movies. Kang the Conqueror shows up in one of these issues. The tone of these issues, I mean, I mentioned the mythology of Marvel. This period was kind of the angsty superhero, or like the superhero mixed with tragedy. When you actually get into the cheesy adventures, I think the Stan Lee angst is bigger in the legend than it actually is on the page here. But there are touches of this. The Submariner, who's been exiled from his own people, shows up in the land of the ice. Where, I don't know, just scenes like this. And I think it helps if you imagine these narrated in like the overly dramatic voice of the narration that used to accompany Marvel cartoons in the late 60s, like that Spider-Man one. Or into the 70s, I believe, right? Here, in the land of the ice, this ancient Submariner, and there would be like a dramatic music playing that would help to bring home the weird drama and the tragedy of some of these characters. But by and large, it's not so much tragic and angsty as it is just really cheesy, a lot of this stuff. And again, since Steve Donahue already did such a brilliant job of breaking down issue 1, there's no need for me to do any more than that. I'll just link to his video. So yeah, I'll finish off here. Yeah, I think I've said most of what I want to say.